Hey everyone, Professor Spencer here. Welcome to this video on the hypothalamic-pituitary axes. Learning the hormones of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland can be quite difficult for a lot of students. In this lesson, we'll focus first on the anterior pituitary, leaving the posterior pituitary for a different video. This is because the posterior pituitary is more of an exception rather than the rule. In order to identify the hormones of the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, we need to understand the concept of an axis. When we're talking about the endocrine system, an axis is a three-tiered relationship between the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and the target tissue. So what does this mean? Broadly speaking, when our body gets some kind of stimulation that requires a response, it's this part of the brain, the hypothalamus, also known as the master regulator, that receives the signal, and then it releases the appropriate hormones to create the response. These hormones head to the anterior pituitary first, which is also known as the adenohypophysis, and trigger the release of other hormones. These hormones then travel through the body to trigger the release of other hormones that create the required response. So once we have our response, the hypothalamus detects it and says, okay, that's enough. And essentially this is a classic feedback mechanism. I find that breaking down each axis is a great way to help you remember the hormones themselves and know where they fit in these chains. So in this video, we'll discuss 5 axes, and by the end of this video, you'll have a solid mental map of the hypothalamic-pituitary hormones. Cool, let's get started. Up first is the hypothalamic-pituitary thyroid axis. Remember, an axis is a three-tiered relationship, so we must be talking about a relationship between the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and another tissue in the body. In this case, that other tissue is the thyroid gland. The goal of this axis is to release thyroid hormone into the bloodstream. So, in the hypothalamic-pituitary thyroid axis, the hypothalamus first releases thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, into the bloodstream. This particular part of the bloodstream has a fancy name, which is the hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system. It's basically a network of blood vessels that transports the hormones down this stalk, which is known as the infundibulum, to the anterior pituitary. Once thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, is received by the anterior pituitary, it triggers the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. Thyroid-stimulating hormone then travels through the bloodstream to the thyroid gland. When it gets to the thyroid gland, it tells the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. You might remember from a previous video that most thyroid hormone is secreted as T4, also known as thyroxine. Also, something to keep in mind is that if you see tropin in the name of a hormone, you can be certain that it's not the last hormone in the chain. Tropic hormones are always on their way to trigger the release of other hormones. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed right now, that's okay. I want you to continue to watch the video because you're going to see a pattern as we go. Now let's take a look at our second axis of the lesson, the hypothalamic-pituitary adrenal axis. Again, we've got our three-tiered relationship right in the name. This time, our goal is to release hormones from the adrenal gland. And the adrenal glands are the little hats that sit on top of the kidneys. Specifically, we need to release cortisol from the adrenal cortex and adrenaline and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. And all of this can be accomplished with this axis. Let's say we find ourselves in a stressful situation, which initiates our flight or fight response. Our hypothalamus receives the data and secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, into the bloodstream. But remember, this bloodstream has a specific name, the hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system, which again sends it down this stalk called the infundibulum. When corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, arrives at the anterior pituitary, it tells the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH then travels through the bloodstream to the adrenal glands. When ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, arrives at the adrenal gland secretes cortisol from the adrenal cortex and adrenaline and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. Notice how this is basically the same pattern as we saw before with the thyroid gland, except this time we have different hormones and a different target. I hope this is making sense so far. Let's take a look at our third axis, the hypothalamic-pituitary growth axis, or hypothalamic-pituitary somatotropin axis. Growth hormone and somatotropin are the same thing. Now remember, we've got tropin in the name of somatotropin, so this is actually not the final hormone in the chain. Ultimately, we need to get to the liver to release insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1, into the bloodstream. IGF-1 tells cells to reproduce, thus growing tissue. Just as a side note, this axis serves more of a growth purpose in children and more of a regulatory purpose in adulthood. Alright, let's grow some tissues. Remember, we have to start up here in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases growth hormone-releasing hormone, also known as somatotropin-releasing hormone, into the hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system, just like we've seen before. Then it arrives at the anterior pituitary, where it tells it to release somatotropin, aka growth hormone. Somatotropin then travels through the bloodstream to the liver, where it triggers the secretion of IGF-1. Our next axis is the hypothalamic-pituitary gonadal axis. The gonads are our reproductive organs, the testes and the ovaries. In this axis, we'll need to trigger our reproductive organs to secrete sex hormones, which are estrogen and testosterone, and to stimulate the production of gametes, or sex cells. Once again, we start at the hypothalamus, which drops gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, into the hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system, and then it travels down the infundibulum into the anterior pituitary, where it releases two hormones. These two hormones are luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. Luteinizing hormone travels to the gonads and triggers the release of sex hormones, while follicle-stimulating hormone travels to the gonads to stimulate the production of sex cells. These hormones also play a crucial role in the female reproductive cycle, but we're not going to get into that in this video. Alright, let's discuss our final axis, the hypothalamic-pituitary prolactin or mammary axis. This works differently than the previous axes we've discussed. Prolactin is a hormone that travels to the mammary glands where it triggers milk production. What's different about prolactin is that the anterior pituitary is sort of set by default to automatically secrete this hormone. This is actually because the secretion of prolactin is triggered by thyrotropin-releasing hormone. But we only need prolactin in very specific circumstances, such as breastfeeding. We don't want milk to just be produced all the time. So in order to keep the flow of prolactin shut off, prolactin-inhibiting factor, also known as dopamine, is constantly being released by the hypothalamus. It travels down the hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary, where it prevents the release of prolactin until it's needed. In the case of a stimulus, such as suckling, the flow of this prolactin-inhibiting factor is stopped, and this allows prolactin to flow freely from the anterior pituitary. Okay, I hope this lesson helped you create a mental map of the hormones of the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. I definitely think that breaking things up by axis is an efficient way to understand what's going on. Let's review what we've learned with a quick quiz. The blood vessel system that serves as a connection between the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary is called the hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system. True or false? A tropic hormone is the last hormone in the axis. False. Remember, if you see something like tropin or tropic in the name, it's on its way to trigger the secretion of another hormone. True or false? Corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, travels from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, causing the anterior pituitary to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. True. This one is hard because of the names. The way I remember it is adrenocorticotropic is a longer word than corticotropin, so I know it has to travel a longer distance to reach the destination of the adrenal glands. What stops the release of prolactin? Prolactin inhibiting factor. Which of these sequences is in the correct order? It's number 2. Hormones go from the hypothalamus to the infundibulum, which triggers the release of other hormones from the anterior pituitary, and then triggers the release of hormones from the target tissue, in this case, the adrenal gland. When I took A&P, my professor asked a lot of these types of questions where you had to put things in the correct order. So I included one here just in case your professor is the same way. Okay, great. If you made it this far and got all the questions right, you've got a good conceptual understanding of the relationship between the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and target tissues. Remember, rewatching this video is totally fine, and I strongly encourage it because repetition is key to understanding these concepts. When you're ready, move on to the video that discusses the posterior pituitary. I'll see you there.